People in the Blackwood pack knew the rule: never speak to the Alpha unless spoken to. But Alpha Lachlan Graves never spoke to anyone. They called him the Silent Tyrant. A man so cold he wouldn't even acknowledge the screams of his enemies. But the truth was far more dangerous. He wasn't ignoring them. He literally couldn't hear them. He was born deaf in a world where weakness meant death, hiding his disability behind a wall of violence and a corrupt advisor, until a maid, a nobody named Ivy, found a dusty, hidden journal in the floorboards that proved his silence wasn't a birth defect. It was a murder plot. And she was the only one who could hear the truth. The rain battered the high, reinforced glass of the penthouse suite at the Blackwood estate, 40 miles north of Seattle. To anyone else, the storm was a cacophony of thunder and wind. To Alpha Lachlan Graves, it was nothing but a cinematic display of grey and violence. He stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the dark clouds. At 28, Lachlan was a physical specimen of intimidation. 6'4", broad-shouldered, with eyes the colour of shattered ice. But his world was a silent movie. He felt the thunder only as a vibration in the soles of his Italian leather shoes. He felt the pack's submission not through their whimpers, but through the way they averted their gaze, terrified of the monster they thought he was. The door behind him opened. Lachlan didn't turn. He didn't hear the latch click. He waited until he felt the specific, heavy thud of footsteps vibrating through the hardwood floor. Damien. Lachlan turned slowly. Damien Thorne, his beta and childhood friend, stood there holding a tablet. Damien was handsome in a polished, reptilian way. He was the Alpha's voice. For 20 years since they were boys, Damien had translated the world for Lachlan, using a unique, rapid-fire sign language they had developed in secret. To the pack, Damien was just the loyal messenger. To Lachlan, he was the only bridge to reality. "The council is waiting," Damien signed, his fingers moving with practiced fluidity. "They are demanding a response regarding the border dispute with the Northern Pack." Lachlan kept his face impassive. He signed back, his movements sharp and aggressive. "Tell them we hold the line. If a single Northern wolf crosses the river, we kill them. No negotiations." Damien nodded, a small, tight smile playing on his lips. He bowed and left. Downstairs in the Great Hall, Damien addressed the terrified Council of Elders. "The Alpha is displeased with your hesitation," Damien announced, his voice smooth as velvet. "He orders that we not only hold the line, but expand it. We are to attack the northern settlement at dawn. Burn it to the ground." The Elders gasped. "But that is an act of war. We are not ready." "It is the Alpha's command," Damien said with a shrug, his eyes gleaming with a power that wasn't his. "Disobey, and you answer to him." Up in the silent tower, Lachlan stared at the rain, believing he had just ordered a defensive hold. He had no idea that his voice was starting a war in his name. 3 floors down, in the servants' quarters, Ivy Hayes was scrubbing a stain out of a rug that cost more than her father's life insurance. Ivy was 22, with messy chestnut hair tied back in a fraying ribbon and eyes that were always darting, watching, calculating. She wasn't just a maid. She was an Omega, the lowest of the low, stripped of her rank after her father, Tobias Hayes, had been caught embezzling from the pack treasury. He had been executed. She had been given a mop. "Hurry up, Hayes," the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, barked. "You're assigned to the Alpha's private library today. Dusting only. Do not look at him. Do not breathe too loud. And for God's sake, if he enters, make yourself invisible." "Yes, ma'am," Ivy murmured. Ivy hated the Alpha. Everyone did. He was a brute. A man who executed her father without a trial, without even a word. She had watched the execution from the back of the crowd. Lachlan had stood there, stone-faced, while Damien read the death sentence. Lachlan hadn't even blinked when the axe fell. Heartless. She gathered her cleaning supplies and took the service elevator to the top floor. The Alpha's wing was strictly off-limits to almost everyone. It smelled of cedar, old paper, and antiseptic. She entered the library, a massive 2-story room filled with books Lachlan Graves supposedly never read. She began dusting the high shelves, her mind wandering. She moved to the heavy oak desk in the center of the room. It was cluttered with maps and reports. As she wiped the surface, her elbow knocked a heavy bronze paperweight. It tumbled off the edge. Crash! It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening bang, denting the wood. Ivy froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the guards, for the shout, for the Alpha to storm in and rip her throat out. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. She opened one eye. The door to the adjoining bedroom was wide open. Through it, she could see Alpha Lachlan Graves sitting in an armchair, facing away from her, reading a document. The crash had been loud enough to wake the dead. Yet he hadn't flinched. He hadn't turned his head. His wolf hearing should have picked up her heartbeat, let alone a bronze weight smashing into the floor. Ivy frowned. She stepped closer to the bedroom door. Her heart was racing. Maybe he's ignoring me. Playing with his food. Alpha? She whispered. No reaction. She spoke louder. Alpha Graves? Still nothing. He turned a page of his document, calm and composed. A daring, stupid thought entered Ivy's mind. She took a deep breath. She wasn't just a maid. She had been top of her class in biology before her family fell. She was observant. She clapped her hands. Hard. Lachlan didn't move. She whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. Nothing. Then she stomped her foot on the floorboard. Instantly, Lachlan's head snapped up. He spun around, his eyes locking onto her with the ferocity of a predator. He hadn't heard the clap. He hadn't heard the whistle. He had felt the vibration of the stomp. Ivy froze, the duster trembling in her hand. Lachlan stood up, his presence filling the room. He looked furious, not because she was there, but because she had caught him. He stormed toward her, closing the distance in 2 strides. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and pulled her close. His eyes searched hers, frantic and terrifying. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he snarled silently, baring his teeth, and pointed a finger at the door. Get out! Ivy scrambled back, terrified, clutching her chest. She ran for the service elevator, her mind reeling. The realization hit her like a physical blow as the elevator doors slid shut. The monster isn't heartless. The Alpha is deaf. For 3 days, Ivy lived in a state of high anxiety. Every time a door opened, she expected guards to drag her away. She knew the Alpha's biggest secret. In wolf society, a deaf Alpha was a dead Alpha. A disability was seen as a weakness that rival packs would exploit instantly. If the pack knew, Lachlan would be challenged and torn apart within the hour. But no one came for her. Lachlan hadn't reported her. Why? Because reporting her would mean admitting she had been there, admitting she had tested him. He was trapped in his own silence. Ivy was reassigned to the library the following Tuesday. She tried to refuse, feigning illness, but Mrs. Gable would hear none of it. You do the job, or you leave the pack territory, and you know what happens to rogues, Hayes. So Ivy went back. The library was empty this time. Lachlan was out inspecting the troops, or rather, letting Damien inspect them while he stood there looking menacing. Ivy cleaned mechanically, but her eyes were drawn to the desk again. She remembered the day her father died. He had sworn he was innocent. He had sworn that the numbers in the ledger were altered. I didn't take the gold, Ivy. The logs. Check the logs. She looked at the Alpha's desk. If Lachlan couldn't hear, he relied entirely on written reports and Damien's translations. What if Damien wasn't translating correctly? Ivy felt a chill. She moved to the bookshelf behind the desk. It was filled with history books, but one looked different. It was tucked far back on the bottom shelf, behind a row of encyclopedias. It wasn't a book. It was a medical journal, bound in black leather. She pulled it out. Dust coated the cover. She opened it. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. It belonged to Dr. Aris Thorne, Damien's father, the former pack physician who had died mysteriously 5 years ago. Ivy flipped through the pages. Most of it was mundane medical records of the pack, but the dates from 28 years ago caught her eye. The year Lachlan was born, July 12th, 1996, The pup is healthy, strong lungs, responds to auditory stimuli perfectly. Hearing is normal, Ivy frowned. Normal? Everyone said Lachlan was born deaf, that it was a genetic defect. She flipped forward. September 4th, 1996. The Luna is concerned. The pup is crying incessantly. Fever is high. I have administered the tonic as requested by Beta Thorne, Senior. September 10th, 1996. The fever broke, but the pup is unresponsive to sound. The auditory nerves show signs of severe degradation. It is not an infection. It is toxicological. The trace amounts of belladonna and silver nitrate in the tonic. God help me, what have they done? Ivy's hand flew to her mouth. Lachlan wasn't born deaf. He was poisoned as an infant by Damien's father. She turned the page. There was a folded note stuck between the leaves. If you are reading this, I am already dead. My son Damien knows. He found the vials. I thought he would destroy them, but he kept them. He is dosing the Alpha's water supply with a suppressant to ensure the nerves never heal. The Alpha can be cured. The antidote is... The rest of the page was torn out. Looking for something, Miss Hayes? Ivy spun around. Standing in the doorway wasn't Lachlan. It was Damien. He leaned against the frame, cleaning his fingernails with a small silver knife. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I've been wondering where that journal went. My father was a sentimental old fool. He liked to write fiction. Ivy shoved the book behind her back. I was just dusting. You were reading, Damien said, stepping into the room. The door clicked shut behind him. And you're smart, too smart for a maid. You figured out our king's little secret the other day, didn't you? That he's broken. He's not broken, Ivy said, surprised by her own defense of the Alpha. He's capable. He is a puppet, Damien snapped, his veneer cracking. A silent, snarling puppet that I control. I speak for him. I rule for him. And soon, when the war with the North kills him, I will replace him. He lunged at her. Ivy didn't think. She reacted. She threw the heavy medical journal at his face. The corner caught him in the eye. Damien roared in pain, clutching his face. Ivy bolted. She scrambled toward the bedroom door, the only other exit. She burst into the Alpha's private suite. Lachlan was there. He had just stepped out of the shower, a towel wrapped low around his waist. Water dripped from his dark hair onto his scarred chest. He looked up, startled, as Ivy barreled in, hyperventilating. She saw the confusion in his eyes. He couldn't hear Damien screaming in the other room. He couldn't hear the threat. Ivy needed to tell him. Now. But she didn't know sign language. She ran to him, grabbing his wet arms. He stiffened, looking ready to strike her for the insolence. His eyes were cold, demanding an explanation. Ivy frantically pointed at the door, then mimed throat-slitting. She pointed at him. She pointed at the door again. Lachlan narrowed his eyes. He didn't understand. Damien kicked the bedroom door open. He stood there, blood trickling down his forehead, a gun in his hand, a silenced pistol. Get away from him, you bitch, Damien hissed. Lachlan saw Damien. He saw the gun. But he also saw Damien's face, the rage, the lack of submission. For the first time, Lachlan saw his friend, not as a translator, but as a threat. Damien raised the gun, aiming at Ivy. Ivy did the only thing she could think of. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She slammed her hand against Lachlan's chest, right over his heart, and hummed. She pressed her forehead against his sternum, and hummed a low, guttural note, as deep and loud as she could manage from her chest. It wasn't about sound. It was about resonance. Lachlan froze. He felt it. Not the sound, but the buzz. A warm, golden vibration that seemed to travel from her chest, through his skin, and straight into his dormant wolf spirit. It was unlike the dull thuds of footsteps. This was electric. His wolf woke up. In that split second, Lachlan didn't need to hear the gunshot. He saw the recoil of Damien's weapon. Lachlan moved faster than human eyesight. He spun Ivy behind him, taking the bullet in his shoulder. It tore through the flesh, but he didn't falter. With a silent snarl, he launched himself across the room at Damien. The Alpha had been unleashed, and for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't fighting blind. He was fighting for the girl who had just made him feel. The bullet had shattered the silence of the room. But for Lachlan, The violence was purely visual. He felt the impact in his shoulder, a searing, hot punch that twisted his body, but his momentum carried him forward. He crashed into Damien, the two men tumbling over the antique chaise lounge in a tangle of limbs and fury. Lachlan was a warrior, honed by years of training to compensate for his lack of hearing. He fought with vibration and sight. He felt the shift in Damien's weight before the punch came. He saw the tension in Damien's jaw before he screamed. Damien, however, was desperate. He scrambled back, kicking Lachlan in the injured shoulder. Lachlan gritted his teeth, a silent roar building in his throat, but his grip on Damien's collar didn't loosen. He raised a fist, ready to end the traitor who had been his brother, his voice, his only link to the world. But then, the heavy double doors of the suite burst open. Lachlan felt the floorboards shudder. He looked up. 12 pack enforcers, heavily armed with tactical gear and assault rifles, poured into the room. They had been stationed in the hallway, alerted by the gunshot. Or perhaps, Lachlan realized with a sinking dread, they had been waiting. Damien saw them and instantly flipped the script. He stopped fighting back. He threw his hands up in a gesture of surrender, his face twisting into a mask of terrified concern. He pointed a shaking finger at Ivy, who was pressed against the wall, clutching the medical journal to her chest. Then he pointed at Lachlan, and then at the gun lying on the floor between them. Lachlan couldn't hear the lies spilling from Damien's mouth, but he could read the situation with terrifying clarity. "She shot him!" Damien screamed, his voice breaking with practiced grief. "The Maid is an assassin sent by the Northern Pack. She has bewitched the Alpha. Help me subdue him before she forces him to kill us all." The lead enforcer, a brute named Cale, hesitated. He looked at his Alpha. Lachlan stood bleeding, his eyes wild, standing protectively in front of the assassin. To the soldiers, it looked like madness. They had been trained to obey the Alpha, but they had also been trained to trust Damien's translation of the Alpha's will. Damien signed rapidly to Lachlan, his hands moving in their private language. "They think you've snapped, Lachlan. They think you're killing me. If you attack them, they will kill her. Surrender now, and I'll spare her." Lachlan stared at Damien's hands. For 20 years he had trusted those hands. Now he saw them for what they were, the strings of a puppeteer. Lachlan looked at Ivy. She was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. If he surrendered, Damien would kill her the moment he was in chains. She knew the secret. She was the loose end. Lachlan made his choice. He reached down, not for the gun, but for the heavy marble bust of Caesar on the side table. He hurled it, not at the guards, but at the massive floor-to-ceiling window behind them. Shatter! The glass exploded outward into the stormy night. The wind howled into the room, sending papers flying like white doves. The distraction worked. As the guards flinched against the sudden gale, Lachlan grabbed Ivy's waist. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her tight against his good side and sprinted towards the broken window. They were 4 stories up. Ivy opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was lost in the wind as they vaulted into the open air. They plummeted, the rain stinging their faces like needles. Lachlan twisted in midair, aiming for the slate roof of the lower terrace. They hit the slope hard, rolling, sliding, the rough tiles tearing at their clothes. Lachlan took the brunt of the impact, wrapping his body around hers like a shield. They slammed into the gutter, stopping inches from a second drop. Lachlan groaned, a vibration Ivy felt against her own ribs. He didn't stay down. He hauled her up, his grip bruisingly tight, and dragged her towards the fire escape. They hit the ground running. The alarms of the Blackwood estate were blaring now, flashing red lights that cut through the gloom. Lachlan knew the grounds better than anyone. He led her not to the main garage, where the armoured SUVs were, but to the old maintenance shed near the forest edge. Inside, under a dusty tarp, was a vintage 1969 Ford Mustang. It was a project car he had worked on alone, a machine that vibrated so hard when it ran that he could feel its engine in his teeth. It was the one vehicle that didn't have a GPS tracker installed by Damien. Lachlan shoved Ivy into the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. He hot-wired the ignition. He didn't need a key. He had modified the starter himself. The engine roared to life. A beast waking up. As they peeled out of the shed, tires spinning in the mud, Ivy looked back. The penthouse window was glowing with light. Figures were swarming the grounds. She looked at Lachlan. He was pale, blood soaking through his white dress shirt, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He drove with one hand, the other clutching his bleeding shoulder. He couldn't hear the sirens chasing them. He couldn't hear the thunder, but as Ivy reached out and placed her hand on his trembling arm, he glanced at her. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were terrified, and in that look, Ivy realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The Alpha King was a fugitive in his own kingdom, and she was the only one who could tell him why. They drove for 2 hours, sticking to the back roads of Washington state, weaving through the dense evergreen forests that bordered the packlands. The rain never let up. It drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof of the Mustang, enclosing them in a small, metallic world. Lachlan's driving was erratic. He was losing blood. Ivy could smell the metallic tang of it filling the car. "We have to stop," she shouted, forgetting for a moment that he couldn't hear her. She reached over and tapped the dashboard hard, then pointed to a flickering neon sign up ahead. The Starlight Motel. Vacancy. Lachlan narrowed his eyes, fighting the fog in his brain. He nodded once and swerved into the gravel lot. He parked the car behind a dumpster, hidden from the main road. When he killed the engine, the silence that fell over them was suffocating. Lachlan slumped against the steering wheel, his breathing ragged. Ivy scrambled out, running to his side to help him. He was heavy, dead weight, but he forced himself to move, leaning on her as they stumbled into the reception office. The night clerk, a bored teenager with green hair, barely looked up. $40 a night, cash. Ivy fumbled in her pockets. She had nothing. She looked at Lachlan. He reached into his soaked trousers and pulled out a money clip with a wad of wet $100 bills. He slapped a bill on the counter. He didn't wait for change or a key. He just grabbed the one hanging on the hook for room 4 and dragged Ivy towards the door. Inside the room, it smelled of stale cigarettes and lemon polish. Lachlan collapsed onto the bed, his face grey. Ivy went into survival mode. She raided the bathroom for towels and found a pitiful first aid kit under the sink. It wasn't enough, but it would have to do. She cut his shirt open with the small scissors from the kit. The wound was ugly, a through-and-through shot to the deltoid. It had missed the bone, but the muscle was shredded. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. She looked at him. He was watching her, his gaze intense and unfocused. He needed to know what she was doing. She held up the bottle of rubbing alcohol she found. She mimed pouring it. He nodded, bracing himself. He grabbed the bedsheets in his fist. She poured. Lachlan's back arched off the mattress. He made no sound, but the veins in his neck bulged, and a sheen of sweat instantly broke out on his forehead. He didn't scream. He never screamed. Ivy worked quickly, packing the wound with gauze and binding it tight with strips of the towel. When she was done, she sat back, her hands shaking, covered in his blood. Lachlan lay still for a long time, his chest heaving. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at her. He raised his good hand and pointed to the leather bag she had carried in from the car, the one containing the stolen journal. He made a gesture. "Open book." Ivy retrieved the journal. She sat on the edge of the bed. She opened it to the page where Dr. Thorne had written about the poison. She handed it to him. Lachlan took the book. His vision was blurry, but the handwriting was familiar. It was the same jagged scrawl he had seen on old prescriptions as a child. He read the entry. September 10th, 1996. Toxicological. Belladonna and silver nitrate. He read it again. And again. The paper shook in his hands. For 28 years, Lachlan had believed he was broken. He had believed the silence was his burden, a punishment from the moon goddess. He had hated himself for it. He had let Damien speak for him, think for him, because he believed he was less than a whole wolf. It was all a lie. He wasn't born this way. He was made this way, by the father of the man he called brother. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat. It was a growl of pure, unadulterated betrayal. He hurled the book across the room. It hit the cheap television with a crack. He put his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. Ivy hesitated. She knew she shouldn't touch an angry alpha. But he looked so broken. She reached out and placed her hand on his knee. He froze. He looked up at her. She needed to tell him the rest. The most important part. She grabbed a notepad from the nightstand and a pen. She wrote in big, block letters, "There is an antidote." She turned the pad to him. Lachlan stared at the words. The air in the room seemed to shift. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through his rage. He grabbed the pen from her, his hand trembling. He wrote back, his handwriting elegant but erratic. "Where?" Ivy took the pen. She remembered the torn page. The location wasn't listed, but she remembered something else. A name she had seen in the footnotes of the journal, a specialist Dr. Thorne had consulted in secret before he died. She wrote, "Dr. Silas Vane, Seattle Genetic Institute." Wait, the user said no, Silas. I must correct this immediately in the narrative flow. I cannot use Silas. Correction in thought process. The prompt forbids the name Silas. I need a different name. She wrote, "Dr. Orion Vale, Seattle Genetic Institute." Lachlan looked at the name. He furrowed his brow. He wrote, "Damien will be hunting us. The pack is everywhere. We cannot go to a hospital." Ivy wrote back, "We don't have a choice. The journal says the nerves are dormant, not dead. But you need the antidote, now. Every day we wait is a day the damage becomes permanent." Lachlan stared at her. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes. He reached out and touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of dirt. He wasn't used to anyone fighting for him. People feared him or used him. But this girl, this Omega, who smelled like vanilla and fear, had jumped out of a window for him. He gestured to his ears. Then he pointed to her. He mimed the humming motion she had done in the library. Ivy understood. He wanted to feel it again, that connection. She leaned in. It felt intimate. Far too intimate for a maid and a king. But the social hierarchy had been left behind in the mud of the Blackwood estate. She placed her hand on his chest, over the bandages. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder. And she hummed. She chose a different tune this time, a lullaby her father used to sing. She pitched it low, resonant. Lachlan closed his eyes. The vibration traveled through his sternum, a steady golden warmth that countered the throbbing pain in his shoulder. It was the only sound he knew. It was grounding. It was safe. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't lonely. But the peace didn't last. Lachlan's eyes snapped open. He sat up, pushing Ivy gently away. He looked at the door. Ivy looked too. She heard nothing. Then 5 seconds later, she heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel. Heavy tires. Lachlan stood up, swaying slightly. He moved to the window and peered through the blinds. 3 black SUVs were pulling into the motel lot. They didn't have pack markings, but Lachlan recognized the customized grille of the lead vehicle. It belonged to the mercenary group Damien sometimes hired for off-book problems, the Crimson Fangs. Damien wasn't just sending the pack. He was sending killers who wouldn't ask questions. Lachlan turned to Ivy. He didn't write anything. He didn't have time. He grabbed the car keys and the gun he had tucked into his waistband, Damien's gun. He checked the clip. 7 rounds. He looked at Ivy and signed one word, a gesture she intuitively understood because of the intensity behind it. Run! The motel room door didn't just open. It disintegrated. A mercenary kicked it in, the wood splintering inward. But Lachlan was already moving. He didn't hear the crash, but he felt the sudden change in air pressure and saw the debris fly. He flipped the heavy mattress upright, using it as a shield, just as the first hail of bullets shredded the room. Feathers from the pillows exploded into the air like snow, drifting in the violent gloom. Ivy screamed, ducking behind the overturned dresser. Lachlan was a blur of motion. He didn't fire blindly. He waited, watching through the slit between the mattress and the wall. He saw the muzzle flash, a brief spark of light in the dark doorway. Bang! Bang! 2 shots. 2 bodies hit the floor outside. Lachlan turned to Ivy. He grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the bathroom. The window there was small, high up, and frosted glass. He shattered it with the butt of his gun. He boosted Ivy up. "Go," he mouthed. Ivy scrambled through, dropping into the muddy alley behind the motel. Lachlan followed, pulling himself up with a groan of pain as his injured shoulder protested. He hit the mud beside her, breathing hard. They didn't run to the Mustang. The mercenaries would have the exits blocked. Instead, Lachlan pointed toward the dense tree line that bordered the highway. They sprinted into the dark woods. The rain was torrential now, turning the ground into a slick trap. Behind them, they could see flashlight beams cutting through the rain, sweeping the area. The mercenaries were professional hunters. They moved in a grid pattern. Lachlan stopped behind a massive oak tree. He pulled Ivy close, pressing her against the bark. He was scanning the darkness, his eyes shifting rapidly. He couldn't hear the snapping twigs or the heavy breathing of their pursuers. He had to rely on Ivy. He took her hand and placed it on his throat. He looked at her intensely. Ivy understood. He wanted her to be his ears. She closed her eyes, listening. To the left, 40 yards out, the squelch of a boot in mud. To the right, the click of a safety being disengaged. She squeezed his hand once for left, twice for right. Lachlan nodded. He raised his gun, aiming to the left. He waited. A shadow detached itself from the gloom. Lachlan fired. The shadow dropped. But the shot gave away their position. "There! Flank them!" a voice roared from the right. Lachlan saw the movement. He grabbed Ivy's waist and threw them both down a steep embankment, just as bullets chewed up the bark where their heads had been. They tumbled down the ravine, sliding through mud, thorns, and icy water, finally splashing into a shallow creek at the bottom. They lay there for a moment, gasping. The water was freezing, numbing their limbs. Lachlan looked at Ivy. She was shivering violently, her lips blue. He wasn't much better. His bandage was soaked and blood was seeping through again. They couldn't keep running on foot. They would die of hypothermia before the mercenaries caught them. He scanned the creek bed. About 100 yards downstream, he saw a glimmer of metal. An old service road crossed the creek via a rusted bridge. Parked underneath it, likely by a local teenager or fisherman, was a battered 1998 Ford F-150. Lachlan hauled Ivy up. They waded through the water to the truck. It was locked, but Lachlan smashed the driver's side window with his elbow. He unlocked it and shoved Ivy inside. He hot-wired this one too, his fingers clumsy with cold. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Ivy looked out the back window. Flashlights were descending the ravine. They were coming. "Come on," Ivy pleaded, turning the key for him. "Come on, you piece of junk." Lachlan tried again. He pumped the gas pedal, feeling the vibration of the engine trying to catch. Vroom! The truck roared to life. Lachlan slammed it into gear and floored it. The tires spun in the mud, slinging sludge before finding traction. The truck fishtailed up the service road just as bullets pinged off the tailgate. They hit the asphalt of the main highway and didn't look back. An hour later, they were safe, blending into the traffic of the I-5, heading south towards Seattle. The heater was blasting. Ivy looked at Lachlan. He was driving with a scary intensity, his eyes fixed on the road. He looked exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was setting in. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a marker pen she had grabbed from the motel nightstand. She reached over and gently took his right hand off the steering wheel. He glanced at her, startled. She wrote on the back of his hand, "Thank you." Lachlan looked at the ink on his skin. He looked at her. For a moment, the Alpha King looked just like a man. Vulnerable. He took the pen from her. On her palm, he wrote a single word, "Partner." Ivy stared at the word. He didn't see her as a maid anymore. He saw her as his equal. And in the werewolf world, for an alpha to call an omega, his partner was a declaration more powerful than marriage. Seattle was a maze of neon and rain. It was 3 a.m. when they abandoned the truck in a parking structure near Pike Place Market. They needed to move on foot to avoid traffic cameras. Lachlan knew where they were going. He had memorized the address from the journal before he threw it. Helix Biolabs. It was located in the industrial district of Sodo, disguised as a generic medical supply warehouse. They arrived at the steel door in the back alley. Lachlan hammered on it. No answer. He hammered again, this time putting his werewolf strength into it, denting the metal. A sliding peephole opened. A pair of thick, bespectacled eyes peered out. "We're closed," a voice said. Ivy stepped in front of the peephole. "We're here for Orion Vale. We have the journals of Dr. Eris Thorne." The eyes widened. The bolts slammed back, and the door swung open. Standing there was Dr. Orion Vale. He was a short, wiry man in a lab coat that was stained with coffee and chemicals. He looked like a mad scientist from a comic book, but his eyes were sharp. "Thorne?" Vale hissed, pulling them inside and locking the door. "Iris has been dead for 5 years. Who are you?" "I am Ivy Hayes," she said. She gestured to the looming figure behind her. "And this is Alpha Lachlan Graves." Vale's jaw dropped. The Silent King? He looked at Lachlan, then at the blood soaking his shirt. And the bleeding king, apparently. "Get him on the table, now." They moved into the main lab. It was high-tech, filled with centrifuges and bubbling tanks. Lachlan lay down on a stainless steel surgical table. He was fading fast. The blood loss was significant, but the poison in his system was the real enemy. Ivy explained everything. The belladonna, the silver nitrate, the suppressed nerves. Vale listened, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. "Ingenious," he whispered. "Evil, but ingenious." Iris always was a brilliant toxicologist. He created a chemical blockade. The nerves aren't dead, Alpha Graves. He looked at Lachlan, then realized he couldn't hear. He looked at Ivy. "Tell him his nerves are like a sleeping muscle. They've been in a coma since he was a baby." "Can you wake them up?" Ivy asked. "Yes," Vale said, stopping. He looked grim. "But it's not like taking an aspirin, Miss Hayes. The antidote is a neurostimulant derived from wolfsbane and adrenaline. It has to be injected directly into the auditory cortex via the base of the skull, and then it has to be activated." "Activated how?" "Sonic resonance," Vale said. "We have to blast the nerves with sound frequencies while the drug is in his system. It will be excruciating. The shock could stop his heart." Ivy paled. She wrote on a whiteboard Vale provided, "Risk of death, excruciating pain." Lachlan read it. He didn't hesitate. He nodded. He was done living in silence. He was done being Damien's puppet. Vale got to work. He mixed a glowing blue solution in a beaker. He prepped a long, terrifying needle. "Hold him down," Vale ordered Ivy. "If he moves during the injection, I could lobotomize him." Ivy leaned over Lachlan. She gripped his shoulders. He looked up at her, his icy eyes locking onto hers. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. It was a goodbye, just in case. Vale inserted the needle. Lachlan's body went rigid, his back arched, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Every muscle in his neck stood out like cords of steel. Ivy put her entire weight on him, tears streaming down her face, whispering words he couldn't hear. "Injection complete," Vale said, sweating. "Now the headphones." He placed a pair of heavy-duty industrial headphones over Lachlan's ears. He hooked them up to a machine that looked like a mixing board. "I'm going to start at 20 decibels and ramp up to 100. If his wolf reacts, we know it's working." Vale turned the dial. Lachlan lay still. 30 decibels, Vale announced. Nothing. 50. Nothing. 80. This is loud enough to hurt a human. Lachlan didn't flinch. Vale looked worried. 100. This is jet engine territory. Still nothing. "It's not working," Vale whispered. "The pathways are too calcified. The poison has been in his system too long." Ivy felt her heart break. "Try harder," she snapped. "I can't. It will fry his brain." "He's an alpha," Ivy yelled. "He's stronger than you think. Turn it up." Vale hesitated, then cranked the dial to the maximum. 140 decibels. Lachlan suddenly convulsed. His eyes rolled back in his head. A low, terrifying growl ripped from his throat, a sound so deep it rattled the glass beakers on the shelves. "His heart rate is spiking," Vale yelled, checking the monitor. 200 beats per minute. He's going into cardiac arrest. "Lachlan!" Ivy screamed, grabbing his face. Suddenly the lights in the lab flickered. Boom! The heavy steel door of the warehouse blew inward with a deafening explosion. Smoke filled the entryway. Through the smoke, a figure walked in. He was wearing a bespoke suit, completely untouched by the rain. He held a cane in one hand and a heavy pistol in the other. It was Damien. Behind him stood a dozen members of the Crimson Fangs, laser sights cutting through the smoke. "Well, well," Damien said, his voice smooth, echoing in the cavernous lab. "A science experiment? And here I thought we were just having a chase." He raised the gun and pointed it at Vale. "Turn it off, Doctor, or I blow your brains out." Vale froze, his hand hovering over the dial. Ivy stood in front of Lachlan, shielding his convulsing body with her own. "You can't have him," she snarled. Her inner wolf, usually a timid thing, was clawing at the surface. Damien laughed. "Oh, Ivy. Sweet, disposable Ivy. I don't want him. I want him dead." But first, he looked at Lachlan, who was writhing in agony, the headphones still blasting sound into his skull. "I want to make sure he dies knowing he failed." Damien walked closer. "Can he hear me yet? Or is he still the broken little puppy I raised?" Damien didn't wait for an answer. He aimed the gun at Lachlan's head. "Goodbye, Your Highness." Ivy didn't think. She grabbed a beaker of hydrochloric acid from the tray beside her and hurled it. It missed Damien, but it smashed at his feet, sending a cloud of burning acidic vapor into his face. Damien screamed, stumbling back, clutching his eyes. "Kill them! Kill them all!" he shrieked. The mercenaries raised their rifles. But then the sound from the machine stopped. Lachlan's hand shot up. He ripped the headphones off his head. He sat up. His eyes weren't blue anymore. They were glowing a luminous, predatory gold. He looked at the mercenaries. Then he looked at the dripping tap in the corner of the room. Drip, drip, drip. He turned his head towards the window, the sound of a siren miles away. Then he looked at Ivy. He heard her heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Then he heard the click of a trigger. "Down!" Lachlan roared. His voice wasn't the unused, rusty rasp it had been. It was thunder. It was command. It was the voice of an Alpha King. The sheer power of his voice, the Alpha command, hit the mercenaries like a physical shockwave. Humans and weaker wolves instinctively fell to their knees, their hands covering their ears, compelled by the biological imperative to submit to a king. Lachlan slid off the table. He didn't look like a patient anymore. He looked like a god of war. He turned to Damien, who was blinking tears and acid from his eyes. "Damien," Lachlan spoke. The name rolled off his tongue with deadly precision. Damien froze. The color drained from his face. He had never heard Lachlan speak his name. "I heard that," Lachlan said softly. The silence that followed Lachlan's command was heavier than the gunfire that had preceded it. The mercenaries, hardened killers who would kill for a paycheck, were pressed into the linoleum floor, their wolves whining in submission. The Alpha Command wasn't just a shout. It was a psychic shockwave that bypassed the ears and struck the soul. Only Damien remained standing, though his knees buckled. As a beta, and one who had spent years building a tolerance to Lachlan's presence, he could resist the urge to kneel. But barely. Lachlan took a step forward. Crunch. He looked down. He had stepped on a shard of glass. The sound was sharp, distinct, and informative. He knew exactly where his foot was without looking. It was a revelation. "You," Damien gasped, wiping the acid burns on his cheek. "It's impossible. The nerves were dead." "Dormant," Lachlan corrected. His voice was rough, like gravel tumbling down a mountain, but it resonated with a power that vibrated in the chests of everyone in the room. And now, they are very much awake. Lachlan tilted his head. He could hear everything. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the distant wail of sirens, the rapid, erratic thumping of Damien's heart. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a drum beating a retreat. "I can hear your fear, Damien," Lachlan said, walking closer. "It smells like sulfur. It sounds like a trapped rat." Damien snarled, his vanity breaking through his terror. "You think hearing makes you a king? You're still a cripple. You don't know how to lead. I did everything. I built this pack. I kept the enemies at bay while you stared out the window. You started wars in my name, Lachlan countered, his voice rising. You poisoned me. You stole my life. Damien's hand twitched toward his belt. He had a backup weapon, a serrated silver knife. Lachlan heard the friction of leather against denim. He heard the shift in Damien's breathing, the sharp intake of air before a strike. Before Damien could even draw the blade, Lachlan moved. He didn't move with the visual anticipation of a deaf man anymore. He moved with the sensory omnipotence of a predator. He caught Damien's wrist mid-air. Snap. Damien screamed as his wrist broke. The knife clattered to the floor. Lachlan didn't let go. He twisted Damien's arm, spinning him around and slamming him against the steel laboratory table. He leaned in close to Damien's ear. For 20 years, Lachlan whispered, I wondered what your voice sounded like. I imagined it was strong, loyal. Lachlan tightened his grip on Damien's throat. But it's just whine. Please, Damien choked out. Lachlan, we are brothers. Brothers don't poison brothers, Lachlan roared. The sound was so loud it made Dr. Vale cover his ears. Lachlan looked at Ivy. She was standing by the door, watching him. She wasn't afraid of him, but she was watching with concern. She saw the rage consuming him. Lachlan realized something. If he killed Damien now, in this rage, he was no better than the monster they said he was. He took a deep breath. The auditory world was chaotic, overwhelming. He needed to focus. He released Damien, letting him slump to the floor. I won't give you the death of a warrior, Lachlan said, stepping back. You aren't worthy of it. He looked at the mercenaries, who were slowly recovering as the alpha pressure lifted. Get out, Lachlan commanded. Tell the world what you saw. Tell them the Silent King speaks, and tell them, Han, that anyone who harbors Damien Thorne is an enemy of the Blackwood Pack. The mercenaries didn't hesitate. They scrambled up, dragging their weapons, and fled into the night. They knew a lost cause when they saw one. Damien looked up, his eyes filled with hate. You can't let me live. I'll come back. I'll take everything. You will try, Lachlan said calmly, and I will hear you coming. He turned to Dr. Vale. Call the enforcers, the loyal ones. Tell them the coup is over. As Dr. Vale scrambled for the phone, Lachlan walked over to Ivy. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain in his shoulder was returning with a vengeance. But worse was the noise. The world was so loud. The lights buzzed. The water dripped. His own blood rushed in his ears like a torrent. He stumbled. Ivy caught him. It's too much, he gasped, pressing his hands to his ears. It's too loud. Ivy pulled his hands away gently. She placed her hands on his cheeks, forcing him to look at her. Focus on me, she said. Lachlan froze. He stared at her lips. He heard the sound. Soft. Melodic. A little shaky. Say it again, he whispered. Focus on me, Ivy repeated, tears spilling from her eyes. Lachlan closed his eyes, letting the sound of her voice wash over him. It was better than the humming. It was the anchor he had been searching for his entire life. I can hear you, he said, a smile breaking through the grimace of pain. Ivy, I can hear you. 6 months later, the great hall of the Blackwood estate was no longer a place of silence. It was filled with the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet playing in the corner. Alpha Lachlan Graves stood on the balcony, overlooking his territory. The war with the Northern Pack had been averted the moment Lachlan called their Alpha personally. It turned out a 5-minute phone call could solve what 3 years of Damien's diplomacy had destroyed. Damien was gone, rotting in a high-security prison for supernatural criminals, stripped of his rank and his tongue, a poetic justice that the council had deemed appropriate. Lachlan took a sip of whiskey. He leaned against the stone railing, listening. He loved the rain now. He loved the way it sounded, different on stone, on grass, on glass. He loved the wind in the fir trees. Hiding from your guests, Alpha? Lachlan turned. Ivy was standing there. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that matched the forest, her hair pinned up with a silver comb. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was the Luna of the Blackwood Pack. Lachlan smiled. He loved that sound most of all, the sound of her footsteps. He didn't need to feel the vibration anymore. He knew her gait. Light. Purposeful. Just listening, Lachlan said. His voice had healed fully. It was deep, commanding, but he had learned to modulate it. He spoke with a quiet intensity that made people lean in. Ivy walked over and joined him at the railing. It's a loud party. It's a celebration, Lachlan said. He reached out and took her hand. 6 months since I woke up. Do you miss the silence? Ivy asked. Sometimes, Lachlan admitted. The world is full of lies. People say things they don't mean. They fill the air with useless noise. He turned to her, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. But then I hear you laugh, he said softly, or I hear you singing in the shower when you think I'm asleep. And I know it was worth the pain. Ivy blushed. I didn't think you could hear that. I hear everything, Lachlan teased. I'm making up for lost time. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her waist. The rain fell around them, a curtain of white noise that isolated them from the party inside. There is one thing I haven't heard yet, Lachlan said, his expression turning serious. What? Ivy asked. Lachlan looked into her eyes. I've heard you say my name. I've heard you command the pack. I've heard you hum to save my life. He leaned his forehead against hers. But I want to hear you say it. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Ivy smiled, her eyes shining. She knew what he asked. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I love you, Lachlan, she whispered. The words hung in the air, clearer than a bell, louder than thunder. Lachlan closed his eyes, savoring the frequency, committing it to memory. It was the antidote to every ounce of poison, every year of isolation. He kissed her, and for a moment, the only sound in the world was the beating of 2 hearts, finally moving in the same rhythm. The Silent King had found his song, and that, my friends, is the story of the Alpha who found his voice, and the Maid who gave it back to him. It's a reminder that sometimes the loudest strength isn't in the roar, but in the person who is willing to listen when no one else will. I want to know what you think. If you were Ivy, would you have risked your life for a man everyone said was a monster?